Well, hello everybody. First of all, thanks a lot for having me here. It's really an honor to have the opportunity to present for the Permanent Peoples Tribunal Session on Fracking, Human Rights and Climate Change. My name is Gheorghiu, and I work as a campaigner and consultant for Food and Water Europe, which is the European branch of Food and Water Watch. And today I'll try to summarize in this presentation the amicus brief we were able to send on behalf, I was able to send on behalf of Food and Water Watch and Food and Water Europe for the Permanent Peoples Tribunal Session on Fracking, Human Rights and Climate Change. Okay, let's get started. So I'll go through the 4 questions that you've asked of us, and I'll try to give the brief summary of our answers. So the first question was, under what circumstances do fracking and other unconventional oil and gas extraction techniques breach substantive and procedural human rights protected by international law as a matter of treaty or custom? And I think before we start really answering the question, it's very important for me to make people aware of the fact that fracking itself cannot break anything. It's just a technique. So if we want to focus on the people, the right addressee, then it's state and non-state actors that we must focus on. So it's not fracking that does breach anything. It's the people behind the technique, the markets behind the technique, and the whole demand that is interlinked with it. And a second very important thing is to define what fracking is, because we have in several parts of the world, we have different definitions of what fracking is and what fracking is not from a legal perspective. For us, Food and Water Watch and Food and Water Europe, when we speak of fracking, we speak of the whole process. So it's not about the pure fracturing of the rocks. It's about the whole industrialization that is necessary and interlinked with fracking. It's about the construction of the whole infrastructure, including pipelines, LNG terminals, and so on and so forth. So it's the whole life cycle that is interconnected with fracking itself. And I think that this is something very important to keep in mind. Now, what is fracking in actual fact, and why do we speak about unconventional and conventional deposits? So usually hydrocarbons migrate through space and time. They try to reach the surface from underground. And when they are then gathered in a natural trap, as we see here, this is what we usually call conventional deposits. So you drill a well and then you start exploiting the site. It's gas or oil that you will extract then out of the ground. What we call unconventional or non-conventional deposits are the hydrocarbons that are being trapped in geological layers. For example, shale layers, coal bed methane layers, or sandstone layers. Because the hydrocarbons are dispersed in the geological formation, you'll have to drill down, sometimes first vertically until you reach the geological layer, and then horizontally into the layer, and then you'll start pumping large quantities of water under high pressure mixed with sand and toxic chemicals in order to fracture the rocks and to release the hydrocarbons so that you're able to extract them. So this is the main difference. However, the European Commission and the United Kingdom have tried to find their own definition of fracking, meaning that they've linked their definition of fracking to the amount of water that is being used per well in order to fracture the rock and to start the extraction of the hydrocarbon. So the threshold they are using is 10,000 cubic meters of water. If you use less than 10,000 cubic meters of water, then the United Kingdom and the European Commission do not consider this to be what they are calling high volume hydraulic fracturing, meaning that a less strict legal framework is applicable. But what they do is to they basically apply this legal framework to certain fracking projects, but this means that a large amount of other projects won't be covered by this definition. Germany has a similar approach. The German government simply redefined, based on no scientific evidence whatsoever, redefined sandstone layers where we find tight gas as conventional layers. They just said it's conventional layers. And they've invented a term called conventional fracking. So if a company in Germany, for example, wants to extract hydrocarbons from a sandstone layer, mainly tight gas, then this kind of fracking, what they call conventional fracking, face less stricter regulations than if you want to do a fracking operation in shale layers, which is, for the moment at least, in generally forbidden in Germany. So this is something that we really have to keep in mind. For us personally, there is no such distinction. So every kind of site that needs to be stimulated or fractured, this all falls under what we at Food and Water Watch and Food and Water Europe understands as fracking, and all the risks and negative impacts that I will talk about in a minute are related to this kind of fracking. But there are attempts to redefine fracking in order to avoid stricter regulation. The next slide I wanted to show, I wanted to make people aware of, is that it is not about this one fracking operation. It's not about one well. The industry will try to get a license for an area, and they will start with 1 or 2, 3 exploratory wells. The whole debate will be about, well, don't worry, it's just one well. Maybe we'll need another one, but this is it. They, in most cases, and I've seen it in the UK right now, they barely talk about the need to develop a licensed field. And this means drilling hundreds and thousands of wells over a lifetime of 20 to 40 years. So when a regional council, for example, or a government makes a decision about whether or not they want to open their doors to shale or tight gas development, they should be aware of the fact that it will be about the industrialization of this whole area. And in most cases, we talk about the industrialization of former rural areas. And alone this fact includes having a lot of negative impacts for the environment, because it's of course a total different scenario to have woods and just a few streets and roads and agriculture. And it's a complete different scenario if you start industrializing this area. And the picture that you see here is the amount of wells that were drilled in Pennsylvania. We talk about over 10,000 wells within a decade, just to give you some kind of vision what shale development really means. Now, if we look the numbers up, they themselves speak, I would say, sorry, they themselves speak a pretty clear language. So according to industry reported data in the Frack Focus database, we had in the United States at least 137,000 of wells that have been drilled since 2005. The water use since 2005 is at least 239 billion gallons. Produced toxic wastewater in 2014 alone was at least 14 billion gallons. And this means that this toxic wastewater, the industry needs to somehow get rid of it. In a majority of cases, this means disposing the wastewater underground, injecting it underground. And this is what has caused a lot of earthquakes in states like Ohio, for example, a state that wasn't really known for having a problem with earthquakes before the industry started to inject large amounts of toxic wastewater into the underground. The global warming pollution from well completions in 2014 alone was at least 5.3 billion pounds. And this is equivalent to the global warming pollution from 22 coal-fired power plants. Now, we also had a bunch of peer-reviewed studies within the same period, and I think that you have or will have a lot of experts that can talk much more about all the outcome of the studies. I just want to mention that of the 685 peer-reviewed studies that looked at the time frame between 2009 and 2015 and only looked at studies, commentaries, and reviews published on fracking for tight gas and shale gas. So this excludes studies related to tight oil, shale oil, and also coal bed methane. But only looked at them, they found out that 84% of the studies on health impacts identified potential public health risks or actual observed poor public health outcomes. 96% of the studies on water quality showed potential positive association or actual incidence of water contamination associated with shale gas development. 87% of the studies on air quality indicated elevated levels of air pollutant emissions and or increased atmospheric concentration, as well as a massive problem with methane emissions. Before I'll start talking about the very, very overarching big problem with methane emissions and climate change, I like to just stress a few facts about the problem and the competition we have in this case with water. A study done by the World Resources Institute back in 2014 found out that 38% of the world's shale resources face high to extremely high water stress or arid conditions. They found out that almost 400 million people live on land above shale plays, meaning increased competition for water and also public concern over hydraulic fracturing that will be more likely in densely populated areas. In China has a very big problem with water or the lack of water. 61% of shale resources face high water stress or arid conditions. And even in the United Kingdom, a country that I wouldn't have thought that they have a problem with water, 34% of the shale plays face high water stress or arid conditions. And we see this also in a direct competition with existing underground aquifers. For example, in North Africa, what you see here, the dotted lines, these are shale plays, and the blue areas, this is these are existing underground aquifers. So you see that there is a direct competition here, meaning that if you want to reach the hydrocarbons in the underground, you'll have to drill somehow through this underground aquifer. The same is valid for big parts of South America. For example, here, where we have the Guarani aquifer, and then again, you see the areas with the dotted lines, these are the shale layers. So in both cases, this is, of course, something of high concern, especially if I think from a European perspective, if we think of North Africa and the problems we already face there with regard to mass migration upwards towards Europe, I think that if something happens there and if we have some kind of massive contamination of these very important underground aquifers, the problems we already face with mass migration will grow. So when we talk about fracking and the relation to human rights and climate change, I think that the increasing social and military conflicts that will be caused by an increased global warming is something that will affect us all, will affect all our human rights, and this is something that we need to keep in mind. We also need to communicate this, I think, in a much more, in a way that the public understands, even the people who are maybe not really keen to switch to renewables, they should be aware of the fact that the expansion of the fossil fuel industry, in particular the expansion of fracking industry, will definitely lead to an increased global warming, and this has its own very negative impacts on us all. This is a graph that shows the problem we're facing at the moment, and also shows the need for swift and courageous actions, because what we simply don't have is time. What we see here is the level of global warming where we should somehow stay, because this is something that we will be somehow be able to manage. So if we stay somewhere in between 1.5 and 2 degrees global warming, this is a scenario that we can handle. If we overshoot the 2 degrees global warming, this might lead to runaway climate chaos. No scientist on Earth can tell what this really means, but what we see already, the impact of climate change that we see already, they threaten the most existential resources that we need, which is fresh water, drinkable water, fertile soils, and also breathable air, basically. And what we see on this graph here is that if we do tackle CO2 alone, we won't be able to stay somewhere in between 1.5 and 2 degrees global warming. It's only if we tackle CO2, carbon dioxide, methane, which is CH4, and black carbon, we will be able to stay somewhere in between 1.5 and 2 degrees global warming. The problem is that we've already reached the 1.1 global warming in 2016, meaning that we will reach within 12 years the 1.5, and within 32 years we will overshoot into 2 degrees global warming. Now, because of all the field studies that were done, mainly in the United States, we know that we have a massive problem with methane emissions from the production of shale and tight gas and shale oil and tight oil. What we can say is that we have a methane loss of up to 4% within the production of so-called conventional gas, but the methane loss of within the production of so-called unconventional gas could be up to 12%. Meaning that, again, if we don't pay attention to this, and if we don't stop the expansion of the fracking industry, we won't be able to stay somewhere in between 1.5 and 2 degrees global warming, meaning that we will most definitely reach climate tipping points, which will then lead into runaway climate chaos. This is also something that Professor Howers has illustrated, and he has even shown that if we take the methane losses into account and then look at the climate balance of shale gas compared to other hydrocarbons, shale gas looks worse than coal. And I'm definitely not here to promote coal. We must go off fossil fuels completely, which means including coal, oil, and gas. But reducing methane emissions, meaning for me personally stopping production and banning fracking, will give us a few more years, years that we need to reduce CO2 and then avoid runaway climate chaos. A new NASA-led study also recently showed that the biggest increase that we realize concerning methane emissions is due to fossil fuels. Now, nonetheless, what we observe when we look at the markets is that the industry wants to expand. And a most recent phenomena I personally came across, we at Food and Water Watch and Europe came across, is that a lot of fracking, a lot of the current expansion of the shale gas industry is directly related to the production of ethane, and ethane is a feedstock for plastics and petrochemicals, which brings, of course, a completely new dimension to the whole pollution scenario, because now for the first time we can say that plastic pollution is the visible ugly face of climate change, and it's also directly linked to the expansion of the fracking industry in the United States. At the moment, we have in the United States alone some 325 new petrochemicals investments, about almost $200 billion worth. And there are underway or planned, 40% are already completed. Now, the question was how human rights are affected. And I think that through what I was just saying related to the slides you just saw, is that we can definitely say that a lot of human rights might be or are already affected by fracking projects. And then again, it's really important to be aware of the fact that we must take the additional infrastructure such as pipelines, LNG terminals, and also petrochemical facilities into account. So I've created this table giving you some of the legal references. I think you again, you have a lot of experts out there who are able to talk much more about this, and also to refer to other existing conventions that might play a role. So what we can say is that fracking projects affect the right to life, liberty, and security of people, the right to a standard of living that is adequate for the health and well-being, the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health and well-being, including the healthy development of the child, improvement of environmental and industrial hygiene, and prevention of occupational and other diseases, the right to safe and clean drinking water and sanitations, the right to freely pursue self-determined economical, social, and cultural development, because in a lot of cases, in a lot of countries, we see strong opposition against the development of shale, against fracking projects. Nonetheless, we see state and non-state actors trying to impose fracking upon people. The right to territory is directly linked to what I've just said. The right of free disposal of natural wealth and resources. I think each one of us, each region, each country should be able to choose what they do with their own natural wealth and resources. We shouldn't allow global operating international companies to extract those resources wherever they want to do, if the people who live there decide otherwise. The right to property is, of course, directly linked to that, whether alone or in associations with others. We see, for example, in the United States, we have now a pipeline project called the Mariner East 2 pipeline. This brings wet gas, ethane, to the Marcus Hook facility in Pennsylvania, and from there it is being transported to Europe for plastics production. And the authorities are using a legal term called eminent domain in order to get access to private property. Now, usually, as far as I'm aware of, is that you can use eminent domain if you need to extract the resources because it's for the good of the majority of people. But in this case, they're using eminent domain to let a private company build this pipeline and then simply export the hydrocarbons to Europe. The right to public consultation has been affected quite a few times. I've seen it, for example, in Germany, where we had no strategic environmental assessment related to fracking projects. We have also cases in Argentina and also South Africa where indigenous tribes were not consulted before licenses were given away. The right to protection of motherhood and childhood can be affected, right to actions preventing the risks and impacts of climate change, and the right to sustainable development. All these human rights can and are already affected in some way or another by fracking projects all around the world. Now we're coming to the second question, which is under what circumstances do fracking and other unconventional oil and gas extraction techniques warrant the issuance of either provisional measures, a judgment enjoining further activity, remediation relief, or damages for causing environmental harm? Well, our stance is pretty simple. Climate change is one of the most urgent and complex threats to our human rights today. And fracking poses significant risks to the natural environment through loss or fragmentation of habitat, disturbance of wildlife, and potential pollution of water courses that support sensitive ecosystems and biodiversity, and is driver of climate change. And therefore, nothing short of an outright ban on fracking and rapid cessation of fossil fuel extraction and consumption will remedy the many associated harms of the oil and gas industry. Other provisional measures, a judgment enjoining further activity, remediation relief, or damages for causing environmental harm are simply inadequate half measures, because the industry will always try to avoid taking responsibility for any damages and or environmental harm they've done. And I think a very good example for that is the so-called ExxonMobil case. We now have evidence that ExxonMobil knew of climate change since as early as the 1980s, but nonetheless, they've tried to lobby against the scientific proof that climate change is real and that fossil fuel industry is directly responsible for the increasing of global warming. Third question is, what is the extent of responsibility and liability of states and non-state actors for violations of human rights and for environmental and climate harm caused by these oil and gas extraction techniques? Now I want to highlight just two cases from the United Kingdom. I mean, there are lots of cases, and I think you'll hear of them or you've already heard of them. So I will just focus on the UK and two cases related to the UK. One is related to a very specific company that plays a very vital role in the fracking debate in the UK at the moment. The name of the company is INEOS, and the company is owned by a billionaire called Jim Ratcliffe. So if we look at the UK, first of all, at the Lancashire case, we see that if we debate fracking and the negative impacts of fracking projects, there is this huge amount of debate around public health impacts, everything related to climate change, everything related to water usage, water contamination, and so on and so forth. But there is also a big question around the state of democracy all around the world when we talk about fracking projects, shale development, and the almost inevitable confrontation between state authorities that unfortunately very often support the private company instead of supporting the people who are opposing the projects and who, at least in my opinion, have the better arguments. So the Lancashire case is, I think, pretty symbolic. It might seem as a small case, but I think it's a good example. In 2005, the Lancashire Council had rejected fracking plans by a company named Quadrilla, but the UK government overturned the local decision and gave the go-ahead in 2016. Now, ongoing protests followed, and with almost daily clashes between activists, quadrillas, private security, and the police. Campaigners also launched a court appeal to stop fracking in Lancashire, but the court dismissed it in January 2018. Now, so far, fracking protesters have nonetheless prevented Quadrilla from conducting the first fracking operation in the country since 2011, but this meant and means a day-by-day confrontation. So they have a camp nearby the fracking site, and it's again, I repeat myself, it's a daily fight for every lorry, for every piece of equipment that goes to the site, and so on and so forth. And you can also see how during the summer months, when more campaigners are, of course, able to come and support the local campaigners, you can see in the graph down below here how the number of arrests grow during the summer months. So the question, the current situation in the UK raises many questions regarding moral, legal, and also democratic legitimacy of the whole situation. The first question is, why is the government questioning a basic democratic decision by a local council? We think that local councils should decide about the basic question of whether or not they want to industrialize their own area. Second question is, why are the courts ignoring the reasonable arguments brought forward by campaigners that, in this case, the environmental impact assessment has not considered the environmental impacts of both the exploratory stage and the full production state that might be thought for in the future? Because it's very difficult to decide a moment in space and time when you say we don't want to have more development, meaning that you will have to take the cumulative impacts into account from the beginning. You'll have to have the debate from the beginning about whether or not you want to industrialize the licensed area. But unfortunately, this is something that many state authorities are not willing to take into account. The third, but it's related to the second question, is why are the courts ignoring the reasonable arguments that the public health impacts of fracking had not been properly considered according to the precautionary principle? And this relates to the question of a full-scale development. It is, of course, a totally different issue if you look on the possible health impacts of one well, or if you take into consideration that you'll have to face in space and time 100 or thousands of wells within your area. And concerns about the state of democracy and human rights in the UK couldn't be high enough if we additionally take into account that, and this is very troublesome, I would say, anti-fracking campaigns and campaigners have been listed alongside terrorist organizations, including the IRA, Al-Qaeda, and ISIL, in official counter-extremist documents from 4 regions of the UK. And Jim Ratcliffe, the billionaire I've mentioned, and the main owner of the petrochemical giant INEOS, secretly lobbied George Osborne when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer to muzzle the unions, to cut company taxes, and also to back fracking. Which brings us directly to the INEOS case. We at Food and Water Watch and Food and Water Europe are currently involved into a campaign, a transatlantic campaign against INEOS, and that's the reason why we've produced 3 issue briefs that looked into the company. One deals with the already mentioned transatlantic plastics pipeline that brings fracked hydrocarbons from the United States to Europe. The second one looked into the corporate profile and history of the company. And Enios is a very, very intriguing and fascinating example, because we see that this company transforms from a former pure petrochemical company dealing with the downstream business of the production of plastics and petrochemicals into an upstream producer, meaning that they want to become the biggest fracker in the United Kingdom. They want to have full control over the whole production cycle. And the third issue brief that we've published looked into their very checkered, bad environmental track record in Europe at all their petrochemical facilities, because we wanted to show that this company, who downplays the risks of fracking in the United Kingdom, is not even able to do a good daily business within their petrochemical industry. The graph you see here is the one that shows you this existing transatlantic pipeline, and I stress this one again because I really want to make you aware of the fact that if we talk about fracking, the impacts of fracking, the role of fracking with regard to climate change, this new dimension of the extraction of hydrocarbons, not even for energy security reasons, is very important. So what we see is an expansion of the existing industry, but now with a totally different focus, the focus of producing plastics and petrochemicals with, and I repeat myself, its own negative impacts for the oceans and the planet, and also for human rights, because we have studies that show that sea salt contains plastic in it. We found plastic fibers in tap water all around the world. Last year, we filmed plankton eating plastic, meaning it has entered the food chain. So it's a very important issue, and it is directly linked to fracking and the current expansion of the industry, especially in Pennsylvania and the United States. I've told you already about Enios and that they want to become the biggest fracker in the United Kingdom. Now, there are a few more things that I want to highlight, and also to raise awareness about the democratic deficits that we see in the United Kingdom. First and foremost, I've already mentioned the company is owned by a billionaire. He's now the richest man in the UK. And I've gathered some quotes of him, direct quotes, but also some kind of actions that Enios has done during the past 2 years, showing us that this company wants to frack no matter what. So whoever stands in their way, they want to push them aside. So first, Jim Ratcliffe talked about the risks of fracking, and he tried to downplay the risks by saying that it is just like a puncture in your car. So occasionally you get a puncture and occasionally you have an accident in chemicals. This is how he sees it. And maybe this gives us also a bit of an insight into the psychology of these big international companies. I think their perspective is a totally different one. And this is, so it's even more important to raise our voices and raise our concerns, because what might be an occasional puncture for a big company like Enios is a major catastrophe for a community somewhere around the world. And we cannot allow companies like Enios and others to stamp over human rights as if it's nothing but a field that needs to be conquered and developed. Another very important thing that opens or gives us an insight into their perspective is the fact that he talked about the symbiotic relationship between the local community and the chemical plant. And he said that this is important because occasionally things go wrong and they need, we need their sort of sympathy from time to time. This means that, and it's also directly related to fracking, as soon as a company starts developing a field, and if it's a company like Enios or with such a perspective, such a vision, means that they will also take over the whole economy of this region, meaning that even if something goes wrong, people will be dependent on them, economically dependent. Again, a very important thing to keep in mind if we add the human rights dimension to that. And there are two other things that I want you to mention, and then I'm done. One thing is that Enios was able to get a court injunction from a high court in the UK against persons unknown, meaning basically everyone. And they can go to jail for up to 2 years, or they can be fined up to £5,000 for any kind of so-called unlawful protest, but this includes even slow walking in front of vehicles, trying to prevent them from reaching the site. Enios has filed a lawsuit against Scotland, who, after a very basic democratic process of public consultation for over a year, has decided to implement an indefinite moratorium on fracking. And they've also filed a lawsuit against the National Trust in the United Kingdom, who have denied Enios access to a nature protection site, the Clumber Park, basically saying that they don't want the Clumber Park to be industrialized. Enios is taking them to court, saying that it's their right to enter the Clumber Park and start developing it. And they do not even shy away from places like Sherwood Forest. They have also licenses to develop shale gas within and also nearby the Sherwood Forest. And now the fourth question, and I'm done. What is the extent of responsibility and liability of states and non-state actors, both legal and moral, for violations of the rights of nature related to environmental and climate harm caused by these oil and gas extraction techniques? Well, again, a very clear statement from Food and Water Watch and Food and Water Europe. We think that states and non-state actors are fully responsible and should be held fully liable for in view of the existing knowledge, this is very important, and evidence, deliberate conducted violations of the rights of nature related to environmental and climate harm caused by the so-called unconventional oil and gas extraction techniques. Thank you.
It was a terrific presentation. You really packed a lot of important things. I agree with Tom about those two elements, but I really appreciate it. Gave me a very good overview of what is happening. We've had a lot of empirical studies and testimonies of specific and individual cases, but this puts it into a kind of political economy of what's going on, and I appreciate it greatly. It's terrific work you're doing.
Thanks a lot for that, and I hope that it will be of some kind of help.
Oh yeah, great help.